medicine and healthcare isn't just about what's going on in your body. It's also about feeling like you have an ally or somebody caring for you along the way. Something I always say, and it sounds very basic, but care is a form of treatment. So mostly if you're looking at why it is that people, may opt to pursue private medical care versus NHS care, the treatment may end up being the same, but the difference is that they don't feel rushed through an appointment, like they have to get to the point within 10 minutes, and that somebody is actually listening to what they're saying. And I think that what the online spaces are offering is a space for people to feel like their voice is valued and heard. And that in itself, and particularly in these periods of life like motherhood, where your identity is being eroded socially and culturally, there's a real importance of feeling like we're being heard.
This podcast is for education and information purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Welcome to the Motherhood Clinic, a podcast about caring for mothers after childbirth, led by clinical experience and real-life stories. If you're a new mum and ever asked yourself, is what I'm going through normal? Should I be worried? Or who should I ask for help? Then this podcast is for you. It's for anyone navigating those early weeks, months, or even years after having a baby. Each episode brings together voices from across the motherhood journey, from clinicians, experts, and mothers from all walks of life. We're here to help you feel more empowered in your unique motherhood journey. We believe in a better start to motherhood.
Welcome to the Motherhood Clinic podcast. And what we're doing here is inviting a range of clinicians, mothers, specialists, and allies to have conversations around motherhood. And I wanted to briefly introduce you. So we first met back in June, and I was very struck in the audience by the stories that you were telling around your personal journeys as to how you came into this arena and the work that you're doing. And what you bring to this conversation is, one, you have a very good broader perspective on what are some of the macro trends and that are affecting women's health today. And the work you're doing at Hormonally helps to shed light on conversations that could always use more, that don't always get the airtime it deserves. I'll hand over to you, Lauren, to give a bit of an intro to yourself and the work that you do at Hormonally. And then I'll talk a bit about the conversation we'd like to have today. Sound good?
Yeah, perfect. No, thank you for having me, Patrick. I'm excited to be here, and I'll do my best to keep it brief because I have a toxic trait of using about 500 words when I could use 50 for explanations. It's lovely to be here. My name is Lauren. I'm the executive director and founder of Hormonally, and we're a non-profit focused on providing access to evidence-based accessible information on reproductive and hormonal health through the life course. So from first period through to postmenopause, we are there to be with you as your hormone ally and hopefully give you the education that you never necessarily had. The sort of one, or my one in founding Hormonally is I am also I always say my friend Johnny actually coined this phrase that I heard and now say it quite often is the why did we start a non-profit? For me, it was naive enough to start, stubborn enough to finish, and really kind of born out of my own research into women's health, specifically perimenopause and menopause. Really what I was noticing from those conversations with women is there was just such a lack of accessible, easy to access evidence-based information that broke down these quite complex periods of our lives in a way where it felt like it also empowered you to take control of your healthcare journey. And so the event that you're referencing where we connected, it was actually Nexus that supported us as a nonprofit to come and deliver a workshop that was focused on how we change the future of women's health to really be focusing on empowering women through those life stages to feel like they're in control of their journey. Really, what we hear so often in the workshops that we host and the work that we do is education is a really important part, but one of the major skills that is lacking is an ability to advocate for oneself with a provider. So this feeling of I can go away and do my research, I can read everything there is to know, but actually when it comes to being in a context with my provider, being able to speak up and advocate for my care, for my needs is more complicated and more challenging. And I think, we've definitely talked about this of how you start to look at what is like a very complex issue and start to make those steps to just really equip people to feel like they're supported to be able to speak up and care for themselves. And also give you permission to feel equipped to ask for the care that you need, but also to know that you're the expert in your body, when often everything around us is telling us that that may not be the case, and this is the information that you should look at versus something else.
Excellent. Thank you. And actually, I should give you, I need to give you credit, Lauren, because you were one of the inspirations. So our very first podcast that we had is with a friend of mine, or a colleague of mine as well, called Charlotte Brown. And it was all around self-advocacy. So the very first podcast we did 7 or 8 ago, right, was all about her journey to understand what she was going through and to learn to self-advocate. So that was very much, again, tied to what you were talking about in the advocacy toolkit, which we can talk about later, about what you are already providing to women out there, which is great. So thank you for that introduction. The conversation we've spoken about that I'd like to have today, there's 3 parts to it. One is the broader social, cultural, political perspective on the world, and looking at those macro trends and shifts that are happening today, and some of the challenges that creates, and what is the impact that's having today around women's health, and the expectations that then sets for women. And then the reality of what that looks like, when women go through those life events, and what is that kind of the how come no one told me this type conversation, and how do we approach that? And then shifting to more, I guess, practical solutions and advice that, in your position as Hormonally, what do you provide to help people see past just the shock and the awe and the overwhelmingness, and to help to navigate your own personal journey with a level of confidence. So that's what I'd love to cover off with you today. And I think you're in a great position to do that. So
My tick list.
Oh yeah, exactly. So why don't we dive into, I guess, that first big area, which is, from your perspective and from your background, what are some of the observations you've seen at a macro level that are happening, that are shaping people's perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors when it comes to women's health? I'll start there.
Yeah. And again, this is something that I could talk for hours and hours about, so I'll try and keep it relatively brief. I think so. So my PhD research was focused on women's experiences of navigating perimenopause and menopause. And that research took place at kind of an interesting time. I started the research prior to COVID, and then sort of COVID hit. And over that period of time, what I noticed really in that space was a massive shift in the way that people were receiving and sharing information. I think we've seen this in terms of health information online and social platforms sort of taking off. But I think the shift that was happening in the perimenopause and menopause space was really significant for the way that we think about women's health generally. Because not only did we see a rise in medical figures using social media as a platform to be able to spread information in a really positive way, we also saw, counter to that, this kind of influx of misinformation or disinformation. And what's interesting in, social media isn't vetted. Interestingly, Meta has just removed its information, like needing to verify information verification on that. So there are very limited parameters through which you can share information. And that's interesting because I think often we go to new media or social media as this really problematic space for sharing information, where we're seeing an influx of, as a result of misinformation, women turning away from certain forms of care and treatment. But also with it, you had this amazing influx of community building spaces. So women who may not necessarily have ever met, coming together and bonding over this kind of shared experience or shared issues. In the context of my research with perimenopause and menopause, you could have women on opposite ends of the country that were connecting about this shared experience of struggling to access HRT. And that support network became a huge part of their journey in being able to access to care. And fast forward a few years, I think we've seen that kind of definitely snowball in other areas of women's health. And coming back to the macro piece, the biggest shift, and one of the reasons we founded Hormonally, is what we recognized is, because of that amazing shift in people being able to access these communities, you also see a rise in communities of misinformation. Really wanted to create a space where it was clinically reviewed, evidence-based information that was providing support for people, where it was accessible. It felt like the type of media that they wanted to consume, but also, had clinical eyes on it, which was really important, because I think what we were seeing is it's just a bit of a Wild West landscape of people sharing information that isn't reviewed. And particularly in work that we do, we see that having very interesting consequences. And the biggest piece of that is this sort of increasing divide that we're seeing between allopathic medicine and providers and women themselves, this sort of increasing gap of, I don't trust my provider, I don't feel seen and heard, I don't feel cared for, therefore I'm turning away from that system of care and seeking support elsewhere.
Mm.
Which isn't to say that that's not a the right course for some, but it is concerning when you're thinking about, are there systems that we're offering that are not necessarily providing people with the care and support that's needed that they're finding in other spaces and places.
I wanted to pick up on a couple of points you mentioned. One was around the misinformation, disinformation, but then how that is also tied to community. And there's a couple of interesting points to maybe explore there, which is one, the most common thing when we speak to new mothers is that sense of anxiety about not knowing what you don't know, and then how to find trusted information. And that is so linked to community, because we had a conversation a few podcasts around with a lady called Michelle Frank, who deals with digital communities. And how do you find the one that's right for you? Because your community, somewhere where you draw a level of confidence from, where you get your information from, but it's also your community, so it's tailored to you. And the difficulty at a macro and micro level is we have communities that are trying to serve, the world or a huge population, so you can't really see yourself within that. But it's good because you might get more medically informed experts informing that global conversation, but you don't see yourself. And then at a smaller level, where you might want to have that more intimate community, you feel more able to express yourself potentially, and you feel this is my trusted group, but you may not have access to the same kind of experts you had at a global level. So how do you navigate that tension between, I want to have a medically informed or the right conversation, whatever that is, but also one that is intimate enough for me to feel like I belong there? And there's a lot of dimensions there. I wanted to explore that with you in terms of, I can see where that challenge arises, because there's so many things at play there.
I think the interesting piece is generally we create community in times, difficult contexts and difficult periods of time in our lives, and we seek out support when we're not having our needs met. I think one of the biggest frustrations I have is the behaviors that are being presented online signal and highlight where and how people want to receive information.
Mm.
I think we are seeing is a reluctance in certain healthcare systems, but equally within the nonprofit space, it's a frustration I definitely have of people being sort of unwilling to embrace the fact that online spaces, whether we like it or not, is predominantly where people go to find information about their bodies and about their health. And if you are not creating the information to meet that need, other people will. And I think there's a criticism against women that really frustrates me, of saying, they went to this space, or why are you listening to a TikToker?
Mm.
Somebody very close to me, sadly last year, had a couple of pregnancy losses in a row. And the support that they found in communities on TikTok was huge for their journey, because alongside this, they felt dismissed and unheard through the provision of care that they were being given. And also the questions that they had were being shut down.
Yeah.
And there is a piece within this that, women are savvy consumers of media, they're savvy consumers of information. And I think often there can be a disconnect with provision of care, not necessarily providing the space time that's needed and appropriate to be able to support through that journey.
Mm.
And find it elsewhere. And that's not on the individual, that's a failure on the system.
Yes.
And how you navigate those tension points, and also talk to systems that are not equipped to necessarily, I don't think the NHS would necessarily start its own TikTok, but I think there is an importance of understanding. That would be great. But this is where our communities are signaling that they feel safe. And they feel safe here because I think medicine and healthcare isn't just about what's going on in your body. It's also about feeling like you have an ally or somebody caring for you along the way. Something I always say, and it sounds very basic, but care is a form of treatment. So if you're looking at why it is that people may opt to pursue private medical care versus NHS care, the treatment may end up being the same, but the difference is that they don't feel rushed through an appointment, like they have to get to the point within 10 minutes, and that somebody is actually listening to what they're saying. And I think that what the online spaces are offering is a space for people to feel like their voice is valued and heard. And that in itself, and particularly in these periods of life like motherhood, where your identity is being eroded socially and culturally, there's a real importance of feeling like we're being heard.
Mm. That's some great points you've raised there, Lauren. And I think what I pick up on, as you said, is the experience of care being as valuable as the output of the care itself. I guess the challenge is, let's take the TikTok example, where there is a valid space where women, people in general, will get support or feel a sense of belonging in those groups. And as you said, if you observe where people are going, that's just a reflection of their needs and where they are getting that information from. The challenge it represents is there are different characters that have different agendas, which you won't be privy to. So the TikToker that is may be absolutely providing valid, helpful healthcare. They may not. They may be looking for views and clicks. The other person there are different agendas and incentives that everyone is either consciously or unconsciously driven by, whether it is a genuine desire to help another person, but may not actually have the medical information to actually prevent that information in the best way. You don't know. You as the individual consuming that information, what is the due diligence you go through to ensure that, or to have some level of confidence that what you're getting is actually not just a soundboard of what you would typically think, or what do they call that, when an echo chamber of what you want to hear, but it's a balanced view where you are getting what you actually need versus what you want, right? So sometimes those two can sometimes be different, right, when it comes to women's health. So it's more of a reflection in terms of how the spaces that people are going to, and how do we get the best out of those.
For sure. And I think, like, don't get me wrong, this is one of the tension points that we face hugely. And one of my biggest concerns is that, in talking about the importance of these spaces, that you create an even further divide between providers and women, because, as a health nonprofit, our biggest win is actually getting providers, women in the same room to talk about these issues, so women are actually accessing clinically reviewed information and also engaging with a provider that has had the appropriate training. I think the tension point comes with agreed people, and that's a big part of why we founded Hormonally. Was we recognize that incentives behind people providing information are not necessarily focused on the individual themselves. I think the piece that comes out for me is we talk a lot in women's health advocacy work about raising awareness. We need to raise awareness. Maybe unpopular opinion, but for me, I look at this and go, awareness has been raised. We've raised awareness. We know that there are currently 700,000 women waiting for gynecology appointments in the UK. We know that if we stood them shoulder to shoulder, they'd stretch between London and Exeter. We know the awareness has been raised that there is a massive issue. And there is a gendered aspect and dimension to this where, of course, we wait, because as women, we wait. We don't want to make a fuss. We don't want to cause problems. We don't want to be seen as a difficult patient. And I think that there are really problematic dimensions to this that aren't picked up on, in which the systems are failing women. Women are signaling what they need and want, and we are not necessarily responding to that appropriately in terms of delivering even basic levels of care to say, how do we ensure, if you're waiting up to 6 to 9 months for a referral, even a year, that we're ensuring that you're waiting well, that you have access to a verified community, that you have access to a support group, that you have access to an information hub that is providing you with that evidence-based information, so you don't feel completely lost and alone and isolated, to mean that you have to go and find that care in other spaces that aren't necessarily reviewed or mediated. I don't know if that addresses that, but it was just something that I feel like the two things can exist and be true. We can absolutely feel there is an importance of being able to create better spaces in which women feel supported to seek care from their provider, and also acknowledge that they don't. And our systems are failing women, and we're not prioritizing that or putting funding behind it. In fact, very opposite, we're defunding. We're taking away. Yeah.
No, I think it's a helpful perspective, and again, these are the observations that you're noticing, where a lot of these contradictions exist, and I think it's seeing it for what it is. That there are pockets of people doing these things, but there are also at the same time these quite glaring gaps in the system, and it's understanding that, and I think it's addressing that at a systemic level. One of the stories that we spoke about was even at a more regional level. So we talked about macro shifts, but at a regional level, like when we go to NCT and expectations that those sets. And again, there is a value to that, but there's also, it can only prepare you so much. And then what is the impact that has on the individual?
I think the biggest thing is that often we communicate motherhood or the experience of mothering as natural, easy, and something that you're born to be able to do. And actually, for lots of people, this isn't their experience. We have a number of resources on our website specifically focused on mental health shifts during the postpartum period and even during pregnancy, because I think there is this expectation for the individual that motherhood is something that should be celebrated and embraced. And of course, it's a wonderful experience for people, but there are lots of individuals that when faced with the experience of mothering for the first time, I always say that NCT classes cannot prepare you for the emotional and physical impact, sleep deprivation on your body, but also you go through this incredibly physically traumatizing experience. Often for many women that we speak to, they didn't feel adequately prepared for what was about to happen to their bodies, not just during birth, but afterwards. And then imagine you open up your phone, you're feeling absolutely terrible, and there's somebody, twirling around in a wheat field holding their baby, being like, this is the best thing ever. Not to say don't twirl in wheat fields, but like that would be your lived experience. In fact, like, my sister just had a baby, and watching the kind of physical toll this had on her body and her emotional state was really quite powerful to be in proximity to. And also the work that we do, particularly sort of addressing this misinformation and disinformation, or this kind of space of beautiful motherhood. The contrast there was quite striking for me. And, I definitely felt that empathy and compassion for women going through that. We already create and position systems in which women are often feeling like they're failing. And it just feels like we're feeding that even more to sort of have this belief that this should be the most natural thing in the world, when actually it's complex and highly unique for the individual as well.
These are all important points to consider, if you are expecting or have just given birth, or even, a while along that journey, in order to process what you have been through, I think is very valuable. Those insights are helpful just for anyone listening, I hope, to reflect and get insight into what they went through or what they might go through in future. I'm curious, with your level of insight, what have you seen that's actually helped her? What have you seen have there been anything that struck you, or maybe it was surprising in terms of what she went through to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I always say is advice should be offered only when asked, and a person's experience of parenting is their journey, and support, even if it's well intentioned, isn't always helpful. So I think for me, it has actually been about taking a step back and really trying to signpost back to providers when there are issues coming up, to try and strengthen that relationship that exists between her and the systems of care that are designed to be able to serve her. So I can know that for myself, I work in women's health, I have experience of working in women's health, but I'm not a medical provider. And if I'm talking about her experience of parenting, I can offer emotional support if asked for, if she reaches out in that way. But for me, ultimately, it's been about trying to strengthen those relationships with feeling like she has permission to reach back out to her care team for physical symptoms that have come up. That question mark of, oh, I don't know if this is a problem. It's probably fine. I don't want to waste anyone's time. It's actually recognizing that's what your care team is there for, and they should be there to support you during that period. So for me, it's sort of about being her advocate to keep engaged with the systems of support, advice, and care that are there and designed to care for her with the most experience. Because I think often we all become experts at these times in life, and we all draw upon our own experiences or knowledge, but actually it's that person's journey to navigate with input from qualified professionals, not the systems of well-intentioned support around you, but not necessarily qualified support. Yeah.
Thank you for that insight. The topic of permission comes up a lot in these conversations. And I love your point about providing solutions when asked for. We spoke about in our second conversation, a friend of mine runs the Dad Table, which is a forum for dads. And his principle, he gives an intro, and it's like, don't provide a solution unless asked for. I've mentioned that previously. I think is a wonderful way. Something I'm also curious about that is related to that is when we talk about advocates and how you, as someone that is supporting a loved one, oftentimes when they go through difficulties, let's take, for instance, things like postpartum depression, there are two things that sit together that don't necessarily feel like they do belong together, which is, on the one hand, I absolutely advocate where provide a solution when asked for, but there are also situations where sometimes that person doesn't know they need help. And so the example I gave was someone going through depression may not realize they are going through depression. And oftentimes it is their loved one or their carers or their partners that identifies the need that they do need help. And they are not the ones to ask for help. I can personally identify with those kind of situations where you don't realize you need the help, but someone, like, I'm lucky that I've got my wife, she takes care of me. She's like, you don't realize what but I know you. So how do you provide that you're more there to support them, but don't usher in your judgment and your values and your solutions? But at the same time, how do you also work with someone that might clearly need that or that you feel does need that? And I don't have an answer there. It's more just an observation that those two situations can coexist.
Totally. Yeah, and I think it's unique and individual to that person. So just to provide an example, if it feels like having that conversation may be too overwhelming for them or for you, if that you don't have that type of relationship where you can talk openly, sending support resources on to someone, being able to say, hey, I came across this and I thought you might find it interesting, not even necessarily putting, for some people that might land as patronizing or kind of, why would you send that to me? But I often think if there's positive intention behind the action, people can get over any kind of immediate reaction of feeling criticized or judged by knowing that your intention is there.
Mm,
I think also just providing spaces for people to really feel safe to open up about the experiences that they're navigating. So really kind of, one thing that I've mentioned already, but I think we do have socially and culturally this, I don't even know if we're conscious of it, but we have this propensity to erode a mother's personhood. So when a baby is born, everybody is concerned about the baby. Let me hold the baby. I want to see the
yeah.
baby, and actually, so a very good friend of mine said you always know the difference between obs and gynae because of after the baby is born, you just have two groups of professionals, one that's immediate to mother, one that's immediate to baby. And I think actually
Mm,
it's about as an advocate for your friend, for your partner, for your loved one, of just really providing them with the space to come back to themselves, remind
mm,
all the things that they loved to do and engage in before the baby was born, really checking in and providing for that space for them to be able to really talk openly about how they're feeling. And often, I think it's often a lack of that space that means that we're not even checking in with ourselves. And then when that space is opened up, people feel more able to share about their experiences and kind of reflect on that and say, you know what, actually, yeah, that has been really hard, or I am struggling with that, or I do feel quite judged, or yeah.
mm.
And kind of being that sounding board for people to just be able to actually express and talk. But I think it's a very nuanced and individual, unique kind of journey that you have to go on with that person.
Yes.
I do think signposting can be really helpful if we have a few resources on our website, but there are loads of amazing organizations that kind of have really great resources that you can kind of just send on or say, I saw this and thought of you. Yeah.
That's there's a very powerful concept, this notion of creating a space and a safe space where you feel seen and you feel heard. And where you do that, whether that's you as a carer or you as the person that wants to navigate that yourself, and what does that look like, whether that's physical, online, or both, etc. That's another big concept that comes up time and again, because as you said, and we do it to ourselves. And I say we, again, not as a new mother, but as a father, I certainly did that, which is as soon as we had our boy, it's like all attention goes. And I guess that is an instinct, right? It's a parental instinct, which is you just focus on this helpless thing that you're like, what the hell do I do with this? And, you forsake your needs to a certain extent. But then there's a point where there's probably a healthy and then a certainly unhealthy element of when you do that, where now you've forgotten yourself. And that identity shift is huge because it is a life transforming event. That to go on to the topic you mentioned about that Pandora's box, which is you open that box and all of a sudden you're like, we would joke about that there ain't no refunds on this now. You're not putting that back in. That you've got it now. You made the decision. You've worked hard, and especially for people that may have had fertility struggles, where
Yeah.
you've invested so much into this journey, and then you've this feeling of like, well, you're lucky because you've got a baby now, so you should be grateful. And not quit your whining, but like I say this not from other people, but to ourselves. Is like I should be grateful for this experience. And you're like, this sucks. I haven't slept in like a few months, and I should. And this is irrespective of other people telling you. This is you telling yourself, saying, I'm the lucky one. And to a certain extent, you are lucky.
Yeah.
But it's balancing, and this is where I think it's that acceptance of the beautiful, the messy, the chaotic, the life-changing. There are those amazingly beautiful emotions and feelings, and there's also the shitty, crappy, what the hell is this going on? And they coexist, and they're all true. And I think it's not taking any one of those elements as the truth, and it's not also this kind of scaremongery of like, this is going to be the most. I mean, it is going to be brutal, but it's also it's all of those things. And I think it's coming back to the space for yourself. However you create that, whether that's a physical space, just time to yourself, or whatever that is, or asking for that space, or realizing you even need that, I think is the critical part, I think, to pick up from this conversation. Because I think, as you said, oftentimes the parental instinct is that I don't need that because I'm, what is more of need? This helpless thing that is I've brought into the world, which cannot survive without me, or me where I feel, and this is where permission comes in, which is I feel guilty because I don't feel like I have permission because, this is me being a bit selfish or so. And I say that as a father, not even as a mother. And that motherly instinct will be, I feel, obviously greater given everything you've been through, the 9 months that you've been carrying this baby and the hormonal shifts. So that's going to be that much more intense, I would imagine. So, I think it was just a reflection. And again, I like the analogy you spoke about the Pandora's box, which is, you think you want this thing, and then all of a sudden, whoa, there's no stopping it once it comes out, right?
Totally. And I think there are a couple of things you say in that which are important to acknowledge, which is, you mentioned the kind of the feeling overwhelmed and feeling like you're not doing a good job, or that you're constantly in this and you don't have, during that period of time, there isn't necessarily the option to like, yeah, you're right. You can't send a baby back, but
No refund.
it's where it's like at a very stressful job, because parenting is also labor. This is huge emotional, physical labor, and we don't often talk about it in that way. Being around people that parent, I am just constantly overwhelmed and in awe of this like incredible thing. And even small moments where you just say, okay, I need half an hour just to myself. If you are privileged enough to have a person to support you in that caring role, even taking that step back just for 30 minutes to be able to say, I went for a walk in the park, I got a coffee, I did that thing for me, and allows me to come back more prepared and more able. But I think often, lots of people are not even in that position where they're able to do that. So that constant, there's just no respite or support. And on top of that, you have the physical impact of no sleep, usually not being able to necessarily care for yourself because you're having to be quick and on the go. So it's not this kind of necessarily beautiful experience that sometimes we're marketing motherhood to be. And I really liked what you said about it's everything in between. That's not to say that you don't have that incredible moment where it feels like the sun's shining through the window in the perfect way and you're playing this beautiful, lovely game and you're having this incredible experience. And then, half an hour later, there's shit coming out the legs of a nappy and it's just the worst, and I think it's all of the spectrum of difference in motherhood that we aren't necessarily representing.
Yes.
And particularly the piece that you pick up on it if someone has had that struggle with a fertility journey and that feeling of, I should be grateful or I should be, there's no way you should feel. You just, and I always say there's no such thing as harder, there's just hard. And I think if we're able to experience more compassion and empathy for people who are just existing and trying their best in this process, then, we're able to create those spaces where every truth is welcome and we're here to support you in that. Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you for that. I think that last point is that yeah, is a very good topic, but it's your truth or your personal journey. Everyone will have a very unique motherhood journey or parental journey. Or even, as I say, we're talking on this conversation around motherhood, but I think in any shift in life that is unique to you, you have your own unique background, your own resources, your very own, your childhood and the way that you were raised. So that truth for you is yours alone. And I think it's being aware of that and as I say, carve out a space for yourself and feel like whether it's permission or empowerment, because I think a big part of what Hormonally does is that feeling of emotional permission, feeling empowered so that you do have that confidence to chart your own path, wherever that is in life, whether that's motherhood, perimenopause, menopause, or even outside of the health spectrum, any kind of journey in life, I think is relevant. But I won't get too philosophical at this point because that's not the focus of this discussion. I wonder in the last segment of the conversation is to look at this from a practical perspective. We've talked so far about, these macro level influences and shifts in the culture, what's the impact that has on the individual around mismanaged expectations. We've talked about the reality of this transition and the effect that it has hormonally and physically. We talked about Pandora's box and mindset. I wonder in the last segment is what are some of the practical things that Hormonally or yourself are suggesting that are helpful for people? Are there any kind of key things that jump out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Pandora's box analogy that we've spoken about before, that for me was just, in creating a lot of the resources that we have, it was reflecting and responsive to conversations we had with women where, the feedback was every time I entered this stage of life or a new period in which, let's take motherhood as an example. It felt like somebody was opening the lid on a Pandora's box and all of this stuff came out and I was completely unprepared. But that wasn't unique to one area. It wasn't just perimenopause and menopause or just motherhood. It was through the life course that we are not preparing women for what they are going to navigate.
Hmm.
And I think that there's almost this, like, sometimes a dynamic in which we treat women a little bit like naive children that aren't able to deal with that information or be prepared in the way that they need to be prepared. And coming back to our previous conversation of both things can exist, I think we always say, there's nothing using menopause, there's nothing you can do to stop menopause from happening, but knowing what to expect can help you to feel more prepared. And I think you can apply that to so many different areas of women's health to say, there's nothing you can necessarily do to stop this from happening, but knowing what to expect, knowing what your treatment options are, can help you to feel more prepared, in control, and empowered. So I guess our approach at Hormonally is twofold. We have the educational resources. We have over 40 plus evidence-based resources on our website, but we also focus on self-advocacy because what we recognize is that without that confidence, or I don't want to use the word entitlement because it's not entitled to ask for care that you need, but without that sense of confidence to know that you are entitled to walk into your provider's office and push for information and care that you need and deserve. And really that's our focus area, is taking that education but also being able to do something about it. So not
Yes.
just saying, yeah, I know there's a problem, but actually I'm not able to action or do anything about it. We're trying to provide those tangible resources to get people to reflect upon what is the information I need to prepare to be able to take to my provider to action this and to do something to help me on my journey to wellness, to feeling more myself and feeling more in control. And it's definitely a more complex journey than just, reflecting once or twice. Sometimes it's about really kind of, knuckling down for the long term and knowing that it's not always going to be straightforward, but really equipping women to feel supported and within a community where, you have an ally with you to support you on that journey throughout all the stages of your reproductive life.
Great.
Does that
Thank
answer?
you.
Patrick.
It does, absolutely. Well, I think one last thing I would do is for people listening in, please promote Hormonally. We talk about what's the address, what do they look for, what are the things available on there, and anything else you're aware of for that matter that are just these very clear, practical guides or signposting. So what's the address, or where can people find you guys?
So we're hormonally.org. Our website, as I mentioned, has over 40 plus evidence-based resources in our hormone hub. And we cover everything from first period all the way through to postmenopause. If you're also the partner or support person of somebody who's navigating hormonal shifts or transitions in their life, and we also have resources available for those that are caring. So, for example, Patrick, we have a resource on there for loved ones or fathers in that role. We've also just launched our self-advocacy toolkit, which is a downloadable workbook that kind of takes you through symptom tracking, preparing for an appointment, and also navigating provider pushback. So if you're in that situation where we actually do find that the majority of people are very good at doing their homework and researching what's going on in their body. But actually, when it comes to that interaction and a provider says, I don't really understand why you'd need that, or that's not necessary, the skill set of being able to have those tools to be able to deal with that, ask for clarification and building up that confidence. So that's downloadable on our website as well. So please head over to hormonally.org and have an explore and a look around.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lauren. This has been really helpful. I hope we can do more of this stuff. But
Absolutely.
I was saying, I was really taken by the impact that you guys are having in this space. And just, I think, the insights that you have around what's happening in the world and the impact that's having. So again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very
Would encourage people to check out Hormonally and feedback on this conversation as well. But thank you again.